Good evening. Welcome to the National Museum of Women in the Arts. We're at the last reading of this year's literary series, and it's wonderful to see many faces of you who have come and been here before. We do have a few programs coming up that I wanted to make you aware of that are happening in the next few days. This coming Sunday, we have a theater performance called Death of the Father. It's being produced here in the auditorium. It's at 2 o'clock, and it's a free performance. So if you'd like to attend, please join us. There are also flyers right outside the door that will give you more information. We have two other programs coming up. On Sunday, June 7th, we'll have students from 4 DC public high schools who have been working with the writers in our literary series to hone their writing skills and to learn a little bit more about the craft of writing. And they'll be reading from their own works here, and that's Sunday, June 7th at 2 p.m. That's also a free program. And if you're interested in coming, please make a reservation so we know how many people will be attending. One of the other programs we have this summer is on June 11th. We have Kate Jansen, who is the chef and owner of Firehook Bakeries in the area. And she's part of our Women of Excellent Taste series, and she'll be talking about her career path, her sources of inspiration, and food as an art form. So join us on June 11th for that event. We'd also like to welcome C-SPAN here tonight. They are covering this event, and I know that they're covering other book-related events across the country. I don't know exactly when it's going to air, but if you surf and stop at C-SPAN from time to time and see if you see tonight's reading, they're on C-SPAN. I want to take just a moment now and introduce Faye Moskowitz, who is going to introduce Grace Paley. For those of you who have been participants in our literary series, you will recall that Faye Moskowitz was the last reader that we had in last year's series, so it's completely fitting that we have her here tonight to introduce Grace Paley. I was talking with Faye on the telephone and asked her what could I say in an introduction, or how could I introduce her to this audience, and she said, she was very gracious and said, "Oh, I'm here to introduce Grace Paley." But she did indicate that she has recently been elected chair of the English Department at George Washington University, which is quite an accomplishment. So please join me in welcoming Faye Moskowitz.
Thank you. The last time I stood up here, I was worried that I was going to trip over my dress. I haven't done that, so. It's 1955, dead of winter in Michigan. Snow has fallen for weeks, melted, turned to slush, frozen again in deep, grimy ruts. The war is over years before. The men returned to take their jobs back from the women who filled in for them. Our job now, to repeople the planet with our own kind. Ideally, 4 per family. So I'm a stay-at-home mom, the only kind I know. I'm 25, trapped without a car in my suburban tract house where sidewalks circle back on themselves and nothing lies within walking distance anyway. And I'm pregnant again. I've just spent nearly an hour stuffing my 2 children, aged 5 and 3, into heavy snowsuits, boots, hats, and mittens. From the window where I stand holding the free press I've been trying to scan since 6 this morning, I watch them warily, see them stumbling around our desolate backyard, slipping on the gleaming, hard-crusted snow. Oops, the younger is down. His mouth collapses into a wail I can hear even through the double-hung storms. In moments, he is rapping on the back door, crying, licking the snot running from his nose. No argument will convince him to stay outside just a few minutes more. He has to go to the toilet, he says. He's got me. Off come the boots, the snowsuit, the hat, the gloves. Snow melts into a puddle on the kitchen floor, but I'm determined now. I will have my little hoard of stolen moments. He will go back outside. Now, what is it about small children that their bones can turn to jello when you are trying to dress them? I wrestle him into his snowsuit, though he has gone limp under my hands, passive resistance of the most obdurate kind. I throw him on the bed where he lies with his thickly clad arms outstretched, the gingerbread boy, and I grab the wet galoshes one more time. I straighten his leg, tussle with the boot. The leg is rubber, too. When the boot is almost on, he kicks it to the floor. I am a mad woman by this time, yelling who knows what at him. Suddenly, he begins flailing his legs, and one leather-soled shoe catches me square under the chin and sends me reeling, blind with pain and anger. 2 children to keep me company, and I have never been so lonely in my life. Now, why do I tell you this story? I was so nervous and excited about introducing Grace Paley this evening that I reread all of her writing. I kept her collected stories next to my bed, and every night I'd savor one or two of them, getting in touch again with that unmistakable voice, that mixture of grit and gravel that sometimes blindsides you, sometimes pierces you with the directness of a pitchfork. One night I came to the duet called Two Short Stories from a Long and Happy Life. The protagonist in both stories is Faith, the young mother raising her children alone. In the second story, Faith's friend Clifford, whom she describes as a vegetarian, someone who would not hurt a fly, has just told her that he can't stand her two kids, that she has done something to them, corrupted them in some way. Faith, he says, you've done a rotten job. And then he leaves her. To cut a woman that way, to get at her through guilt about her children. After Clifford has gone, Faith says to her boys, now listen to me. I want you to get out of here. I need 10 minutes all alone. Anthony, I might kill you if you stay up here. But of course, the boy, sensing her despair with the antennae only children have, will not leave her side. He crawls into her lap and puts his arm around her neck. I'm never going to go away, he says. I'm going to stay right here next to you forever, Faith. In our bedroom, my husband sees my tears and asks me, what's wrong? It's a long story, I tell him. Too long to go into right now. In fact, I was reliving the Michigan days thanks to Grace and remembering the mixture of shock and relief when I first read The Little Disturbances of Man in 1959. Here was someone, a woman like me, who understood my life, but more than that, she dignified it by putting it into a context and giving it meaning. I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't alone. And later, when I began to write myself, I had the example of Grace and Tilly Olson, too, to help me believe that the experiences of ordinary women were worth writing about. Grace Paley's years of activism in anti-war, feminist, and anti-nuclear movements are inextricably linked with the interests of her writing. She is, to put it simply, a life preserver. Her work captures between covers the little disturbances of lives which might otherwise go unremarked. And in doing so, she validates her belief in the uniqueness and thereby the value of each human soul. This is the mother speaking at the end of Grace's story, Samuel. She has just been told that her son had been killed on the New York subway. Oh, she hopelessly cried. She did not know how she could ever find another boy like that one. However, she was a young woman, and she became pregnant. Then, for a few months, she was hopeful. The baby born to her was a boy. They brought him to be seen and nursed. She smiled. But immediately she saw that this baby wasn't Samuel. She and her husband together have had other children, but never again will a boy exactly like Samuel be known. Over and over, we find ourselves in Grace's writings. She knows about love and loss. Her quirky humor uncorks our bottled up frustrations. Her generosity infuses our dailiness with meaning and permanence. We need her in our world, chronicling for us and for the future the way it was to be alive in the latter half of the 20th century and the 21st century too. We treasure her, for never again will a woman exactly like Grace be known.
Thank. I was going to make a terrible dirty joke here. Okay. Which is which?
They all are on.
Yeah. This one keeps falling down.
How's that?
Oh, very clever.
Is that going to work?
Very clever.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Faye. See, I saw it, Faye. Faye, thank you. I really can't thank you in the right way. Anyway, I'm going to read from my new book to begin with. It's called Just As I Thought, and it has what they call nonfiction, but a lot, storytelling is storytelling. So you tell stories, and sometimes the editors or the publishers call it nonfiction, and sometimes they think it's fiction. So so that's how Maxine Hung Kingston turns out to be writing nonfiction when she's writing the most imaginative stories in the world. So anyway, but so these are some of these are reports or talks I've made at different places, and I've been trying to figure out in the last few days how to read from it. So I'm going to begin with, since we really were talking about mothers, I guess, I'm going to begin with this piece in here called Other Mothers. I wrote it, actually, I was asked to write it at a point when suddenly people were asking me to write things. It took a long time, but Esquire asked me to write something for their Mother and Apple Pie issue. And so this is what I wrote. It's called Other Mothers. I got apple pie in here. You'll see how I squeezed it in a sneaky way. The mother is at the open window. She calls the child home. She's a fat lady. She leans forward, supporting herself on her elbows. Her breasts are shoved up under her chin. Her arms are broad and heavy. I am not the child. She isn't my mother. Still, in my head, where remembering is organized for significance, not usefulness, she leans far out. She looks up and down the block. The technical name of this first seeing is imprint. It often results in lifelong love. I play in the street. She stands in the window. I wanted her to call me home to the dark, mysterious apartment behind her back, where the father was already eating and the other sat at the kitchen table and waited for the child. She was destined, with her meaty bossiness, her size, her suffering, to be dumped into the villain room of social meaning and psychological causation. When this happened to her, she had just touched the first rung of the great American immigrant ladder. Her husband was ahead of her. Her intentional bulk kept him from slipping. Their children were a couple of rungs above them. She believed she would follow them all up into the English language, education, and respect. Unfortunately, science and literature had turned against her. What use was my accumulating affection when the brains of the opposition included her son the doctor and her son the novelist? Because of them, she never even had a chance at the crown of apple pie awarded her American-born sisters and accepted by them when they agreed to give up their powerful pioneer dispositions. What is wrong with the world? The growing person might have asked. The year was 1932 or perhaps 1942. Despite the worldwide fame of those years, the chief investigator into human pain is looking into his own book of awful diagnoses. He looks up. Your mother, probably, he says. As for me, I was not paying attention. I missed the mocking campaign. The mother sits on a box, an orange crate. She talks to her friend who sits on an orange crate. They are wearing house dresses, flowered prints, large, roomy, unbelted, sleeveless. Each woman has a sweater on her lap, for coolness could arrive on an afternoon after-supper breeze and remain on the street for the summer night. The first mother says, Ellie, after 30, you notice it? The years fly fast. Oh, it's true, says the second mother. I am so shocked by this sentence that I fall back against the tenement, breathing hard. I think, oh, years? The next sentence I remember is said about 20 minutes later. Ellie, I'll tell you something. If you don't want to have so many children, don't sleep in a nightgown. Sleep in pajamas. You're better off. Sometimes even that doesn't help, says the second mother. This is certainly an important question, I know, but it is serious, and they laugh. Summer night in the East Bronx. The men are inside playing pinochle. The men are sleeping, are talking shop. They have gone to see if Trotsky is still sitting on a bench in Crotona Park. He did, actually. The street is full of mothers who have run out of the stuffy house to look for air, and they are talking about my life. At 3 o'clock in the autumn afternoon, the American-born mother opens the door. She says there is no subject that cannot be discussed with her because she was born in this up-to-date place, the USA. We have just learned several words we believe are the true adult names of the hidden parts of our bodies, the parts that are unnameable. Like God's name, says a brother just home from Hebrew school. He is smacked. The American-born mother says those are the worst words of all and never to use them or think of them, but to always feel free to talk to her about anything else. The Russian-born mother has said on several occasions that there are no such words in Russian. At 3:45, the Polish-born mother stands at the kitchen table cutting the noodles out of dough. Her face is as white as milk. Her skin is so fine you would think a Polish count had married an English schoolmistress to make a lady-in-waiting for Guinevere. You would think that later in life, of course. One day an aunt tells us the facts, which are as unspeakable as the names of the body's least uncovered places. The grandfather of the Polish mother was a fair-haired hooligan. He waited for Easter. Through raging sexual acts on the body of a girl, his grief at the death of God might be modulated, transformed into joy at his resurrection. When you're home alone, lock the door double, said the milky Polish mother, the granddaughter of the fair hooligan. On Saturday morning at home, all the aunt mothers are arguing politics. One is a Zionist, one is a communist, one is a Democrat. They are very intelligent and listen to lectures at Cooper Union every week. One is a charter member of the ILGWU. She said she would leave me her red sash. She forgot, however. My friend and I listen, but decide to go to the movies. The sight of us at the door diverts their arguments. Are you going out now? Did you go to the bathroom first, they cry. We mean, did you go for everything? My friend and I say yes, but quietly. The married aunt with one child says, the truth, be truthful, did you really go? Another aunt enters the room. She has been talking to my own mother, the woman in whose belly I gathered flesh and force and became me. She says, there's real trouble in the world, leave the children alone. She has just come to the United States and has not yet been driven mad by all the requirements for total health and absolute sanitation. That night, grandmother tells us a story. She speaks the common language of grandmother, a word of English. She says, I said to him, no, I want to be a teacher. Good. I said, what about children? He said, no, not necessarily children. Not so many, no more than 2. Why should there be? I liked him. I said, all right. There were 6. My grandmother said, you understand this story? It means make something of yourself. That's right, says an aunt, the one who was mocked for not having married, whose beauty, as far as the family was concerned, was useless because no husband ever used it. And another thing she said, I just reminded myself to tell you, darling, I know you want to go to the May Day parade with your friends, but you know what? Don't carry the flag. I want you to go. I didn't say don't go, but don't carry the flag. The one who carries the flag is sometimes killed. The police go crazy when they see that flag. I had dreamed of going forth with a flag, the American flag on July 4th and the red flag of the workers on May Day. How did the aunt know this? Because I know you inside out, she said, since you were born. Are you my child too? The sister mother is the one who is always encouraging. You can do this. You can get an A. You can dance. You can eat squash without vomiting. You can write a poem. But a couple of years later, when love and sex struck up their lively friendship, the sister was on the worried mother's side, which was the sad side, because that mother would soon be dying. One evening, I hear the people in the dining room say that the mother is going to die. I remain in the coat closet listening. She is not going to die soon, I learn, but it will happen. One of the men at the table says that I must be told I must not be spoiled. Others disagree. They say, I have to go to school and do my homework. I have to play. Besides, it will be several years. I am not told. Thereafter, I devote myself to not having received that knowledge. I see that my mother gazes sadly at me, not reproachfully, but with an anxious look, as I wander among the other mothers, leaning on their knees, writing letters, making long phone calls. She doesn't agree with their politics either. What will become of mine? Together with the aunts and grandmother, she worked to make my father strong enough and educated enough so he could finally earn enough to take care of us all. She was successful. Despite this labor, time has passed. Her life is a known closed form. I understand this. Does she? This is the last secret of all. Then, for several years, we are afraid of each other. I fear her death. She's afraid for my life. Of which many, many years have passed, much to my surprise. Using up the dead nights in a lively manner, I have come to the present, daughter of mothers and mother to a couple of grown-up people. They have left home. What have I forgotten to tell? I have told them to be kind. Why? Because my mother was. I have told them when they drop a nickel or even a shirt to leave it for the gleaners. It says so in the Bible, and I like the idea. Have I told them to always fight for mass transportation and not depend on the auto? Well, they know that. Like any decent kids of socialist extraction, they can spot the oppressor smiling among the oppressed. Take joy in the struggle against that person, that class, that fact. It's very good for the circulation. I'm sure I said that. Be brave, be truthful. But do they know friendship first, competition second, as the Chinese say, they said? I did say, better have a trade. You must know something to be sure of when the times are hard. You don't know what the Depression was like. You've had it easy. I've told them everything that was said to me or near me. As for the rest, there is ordinary place and terrible time. Aunts, grandparents, neighbors, all my pals from the job, the playground, and the PTA. It is on the occasion of their 100,000th bicentennial that I have recalled all those other mothers and their histories. I want to read something from this too, and I'm going to try to make it be something different, sort of, if I can. I had it. I swear to God I had it. I think I'll read you the immigrant story. It's sort of like the same idea. Different family. Jack asked me, isn't it a terrible thing to grow up in the shadow of another person's sorrow? I suppose so, I answered. As you know, I grew up in the summer sunlight of upward mobility. This leached out a lot of that dark ancestral grief. He went on with his life. It's not your fault if that's the case. Your bad disposition is not your fault, yet you're always angry, no way out but continuous rage or the nut house. What if this sorrow is all due to history, I asked. Oh, the cruel history of Europe, he said. In this way, he showed ironic respect to one of my known themes. The whole world ought to be opposed to Europe for its cruel history, Jack, and yet in favor of it, because after about 1,000 years, it may have learned some sense. Nonsense, he said objectively. 1,000 years of outgoing, persistent imperial cruelty tends to make enemies, and if all you have to deal with these enemies is good sense, so what then? My dear, no one knows the power of good sense. It hasn't been built up or experimented with sufficiently. I'm trying to tell you something, he said. Listen. One day I woke up and my father was asleep in the crib. I wonder why, I said. My mother made him sleep in the crib. All the time? That time anyway, that time I saw him. I wonder why, I said. Because she didn't want him to fuck her, he said. No, I don't believe that. Who told you that? I know it, he pointed his finger at me. I don't believe it. Unless she's had 5 babies all in a row, or they have to get up at 6 a.m., or they hate each other. Most people like their husbands to do that. Bullshit. She was trying to make him feel guilty. Where were his balls? I will never respond to that question. Asked in a worried way again and again, it may become responsible for the destruction of the entire world. I gave it 2 minutes of silence. He said, misery, misery, misery. Grayness. I see it all very gray. My mother approaches the crib. Shmuel, she says, get up. Run down to the corner and get me half a pound of pot cheese. Then run over to the drugstore and get me a few ounces cod liver oil. My father, scrunched like an old gray fetus, looks up and smiles, smiles, smiles at the bitch. How do you know what was going on? I asked. You were 5 years old. What do you think was going on? I'll tell you. It's not so hard. Any dope who's had a normal life could tell you. Anyone whose head hasn't been fermenting with the compost of 10 years of gluttonous analysis, anyone could tell you. Tell me what, he screamed. The reason your father was sleeping in the crib was that you and your sister, who usually slept in the crib, had scarlet fever and needed decent beds and more room to sweat, come to a fever crisis, and either get well or die. Who told you that? He lunged at me as though I was an enemy. You fucking enemy, he said. You always see things in a rosy light. You have a rotten, rosy temperament. You were like that in 6th grade. One day you brought 3 American flags to school. That was true. I made an announcement to the 6th grade assembly 30 years ago. I said, I thank God every day that I'm not in Europe. I thank God I'm American born and live on East 172nd Street, where there is a grocery store, a candy store, and a drugstore on one corner, and on the same block, a shul and 2 doctor's offices. 172nd Street was a pile of shit, he said. Everyone was on relief except you. 30 people had TB, citizens and non-citizens alike, starving until the war. Thank God capitalism has a war it can pull out of the old feed bag every now and then, or we'd all be dead. Ha ha. Well, I'm glad you're not totally brainwashed by stocks, bonds, and cash. I'm glad to hear you still mention capitalism from time to time. Because of poverty, brilliance, and the early appearance of lots of soft hair on face and crotch, my friend Jack was a noticeable Marxist and Freudian by the morning of his 12th birthday. In fact, his mind thickened with ideas. I continued to put out more flags. There were 28 flags aflutter in different rooms and windows. I had one tattooed onto my arm. It has gotten dimmer, but a lot wider because of age. I am probably more radical than you are nowadays, I said, since I was not wiped out of my profession during the McCarthy Inquisitions. I therefore did not have to go into business for myself and make a fortune. You damn fool, you damn fool. Plenty wiped out to this day, and I mean brilliant guys, engineers, teachers, broken. Well, I believe I see the world as clearly as you do, I said. Rosiness is not a worse window pane than gloomy gray when viewing the world. Yes, he said. Do you mind? Just listen. My mother and father came from a small town in Poland. They had 3 sons. My father decided to go to America. To 1, stay out of the army, 2, stay out of jail, 3, save his children from everyday wars and ordinary pogroms. He was helped by the savings of parents, uncles, grandmothers, and set off like hundreds and thousands of others that year. In America, New York City, he lived a hard but hopeful life. Sometimes he walked on Delancey Street. Sometimes, like a bachelor, he went to the theater on 2nd Avenue. Mostly he put his money away for the day he could bring his wife and sons to this place. Meanwhile, in Poland, famine struck. Not hunger, which all Americans suffer 6-7 times a day, but famine, which tells the body to consume itself. First the fat, then the meat, the muscle, then the blood. Famine ate up the bodies of the little boys pretty quickly. My father met my mother at the boat. He looked at her face, her hands. There was no baby in her arms, no children dragging at her skirt. She was not wearing her hair in 2 long black braids. There was a kerchief over a dark, wiry wig. She had shaved her head like a backward Orthodox bride, though they had been serious, advanced socialists like most of the youth of their town. He took her by the hand and brought her home. They never went anywhere alone, except to work or the grocer's. They held each other's hand when they sat down at the table, even at breakfast. Sometimes he patted her hand, sometimes she patted his. He read the paper to her every night. They are sitting at the edge of their chairs. He's leaning forward, reading to her in that old bulb light. Sometimes she smiles just a little. Then he puts the paper down and takes both her hands in his, as though they needed warmth. He continues to read. And just beyond the table and their heads, there is the darkness of the kitchen, the bedroom, the dining room, the shadowy darkness where, as a child, I ate my supper, did my homework, and went to bed. I'll read two more pieces, maybe a little, squeeze a little one in about my mother-in-law in between. This one is called Listening, and it's in the storybook. I had just come up from the church basement with an armful of leaflets. Once, maybe only 25, 30 years ago, young women and men bowled in that basement, played ping pong there, drank hot chocolate, and wondered how in God's separating world they could ever get to know each other. Nowadays, we mimeograph and collate our political pamphlets among the bowling alleys. Here, mimeograph, you can tell it's an old story. I think I'm right when I remember that the leaflets in my arms cried out, U.S., honor the Geneva Agreements. Jack did not believe the U.S. would ever honor the Geneva Agreements. Well, then, sadness, Southeast Asian sadness, U.S. sadness, all nation sadness. Then I thought coffee. Do you remember the Art Foods Deli? The Sudarskis owned it, cooked for us, served us, argued Europe, Israel, Russia, Islam, played chess in the late evening on the table nearest the kitchen, and in order to persuade us all to compassion and righteousness, exhumed the terrible town of their youth, Dachau. With my coffee, I ordered a sandwich named after a neighbor who lives a few blocks away. All the sandwiches are so honored. I do like the one I asked for, Marianne Brewer, but I must say I really prefer Selena and Max Retloff, though it's more expensive. The shrimp is not chopped quite so fine, egg is added, little sweet red pepper. Selena and Max were just divorced, but their sandwich will probably go on for another few years. At the table next to mine, a young man leaned forward. He was speaking to an older man. The young man was in uniform, a soldier, I thought. When he leaves, or if I leave first, I'll give him a leaflet. I don't want to, but I will. Then I thought, poor young fellow. God knows what his experience has been. His heart, if it knew, would certainly honor the Geneva Agreements. But it would probably hurt his feelings to hear one more word about how the USA is wrong again and how he is an innocent instrument of evil. He would take it personally, although we who are mothers and have been sweethearts All of us know that soldier is what 1 million boys have been forced to be in every single one of 100 generations. Uncle Stan, the soldier boy, was saying, I gotta tell you, we had to have a big wedding then, Mama San, Papa San, everybody there. Then I got rotated. I wrote to her. Don't think I didn't. She has a nice little baby girl. But Stan, basically, I want to settle down. I already re-enlisted once. It would be good if I got to be a construction worker. If you know someone, one of Tommy's friends, if you got a contact, I could go over for a year or two. She wouldn't want to come back here. Here's a picture, see? She has her old grandma. Everybody's smiling, right? I'm not putting her down, but I would like to find a good-looking American girl. Someone nice, I mean, and fall in love and settle down. You know, I'm 24 already. Uncle Stan said, 24, huh? Then he asked for the check. 2 coffees, 2 Helen someone or others. While the waitress scribbled, I bravely, but against my better judgment, passed one of the leaflets to the young man. He stood up, he looked. He looked at me. He looked at the wall. Oh, shit. He crumpled the leaflet in one hand. He looked at me again. He said, oh, I'm sorry. He put the leaflet on the table. He smoothed it out. Let's go, said Uncle Stan. I'd finished my lunch, but Art Foods believes that any eating time is the body's own occasion and must not be hurried. In the booth behind me, 2 men were talking. The first man said, I already have 1 child. I cannot commit suicide until he is at least 20 or 22. That's why when Rosemary says, oh, Dave, a child, I have to say, Rosemary, you deserve one. You do, you're a young woman. But no, my son, Lucy, is now 12 years old. Therefore, if things do not work out, if life does not show meaning, if I cannot give up drinking, if I become a terrible drunk and know I have to give it up but cannot, and then need to commit suicide, I think I'd be able to hold out 8 or 9 years. But if I had another child, I would then have to last 20 years. I cannot. I will not put myself in that position. The other man said, I too want the opportunity, the freedom to commit suicide when I want to. I too assume that I will want to in 10, 20 years. However, I have my responsibilities to the store, the men that work there, and my real work to finish. The one serious thing that would make me commit suicide would be my health, which I assume will deteriorate, cancer, heart disease, whatever. I refuse to be bedridden and dependent, and therefore am sustained in the right to leave this earth when I want to do so and on time. The men congratulated each other on their unsentimentality, their level-headedness. They said almost at the same time, you're right, you're right. I turned to look at them. A little smile just tickled the corners of their lips. I passed one of my leaflets over the back of the booth. Without looking up, they began to read. Jack and I were at early morning breakfast when I told him the 2 little stories. And Jack, I said, one of those men was you. Well, he said, I know it was me. You don't have to remind me. I saw you looking at us. I saw you listening. You don't have to tell stories to me in which I'm a character, you know. Besides, those stories are about men, he said. You know, I'm more interested in women. Why don't you tell me stories told by women about women? They're too private. Why don't you tell them to me, he asked sadly. Well, Jack, you have your own woman stories, you know, your falling in love stories, your French woman during the Korean War stories, your magnificent woman stories, your beautiful new young bride stories, your political comrade, though extremely beautiful stories. Silence, the space that follows unkindness in which little truths growl. Then Jack asked, Faith, have you decided not to have a baby? No, I've just decided to think about it, but I haven't given it up. So with the sweetness of old, forgiving friendship, he took my hand. My dear, he said, perhaps you only wish that you were young again. So do I. At the store, when young people come in waving youth's unfurled banner, hope, meaning their pockets are full of someone's credit cards, I think new toasters, brand new curtains, sofa convertibles. I hadn't thought of furniture from the discount store called Jack, Son of Jake, as a song of beginnings, but I guess that's what it is, straw for the springtime nest. Now listen to me, he said, and we began to address each other slowly and formally, as people often do when seriousness impedes ease. Some stately dad inquired, "Listen, he said, "our old children are just about grown. Why do you want a new child? Haven't we agreed often? Haven't we said that it had become noticeable that life is short and sorrowful? Haven't we sometimes in the last few years used the word terrible, and we mean to include in it the word terror? Everyone knows this about life, though of course some fools never stop singing its praises." "Well, they're right," I said, in my turn. "Yes, and this is in order to encourage the young, whom we have after all brought into the world. They must not be abandoned. We must," I said, "continue pointing out simple and worthwhile sights, such as, in the countryside, hills folding into one another in light green spring or white winter, and the sky, which is always astonishing, either in its customary blueness or the configuration of clouds, the way they're pushed in their softest parts by the air's breath and change shape and direction and density. Not to mention our own beloved city, crowded with day and night workers, shoppers, walkers, and the subway trains, which people fear sometimes, but they're so handsomely lined with pink to dark, dark brown faces, golden tans and yellows scattered amongst them. It's very important to emphasize what is good or beautiful, so as not to have a gloomy face when you meet some youngster who has begun to guess." "Well," Jack said. Then he said, "You know, I like your paragraphs better than your sentences." That comment wasn't made in order to set the two forms in hostile opposition. It was still part of the dance, a couple of awkward, critical steps from theory to practice. "Perhaps," he said, "if we start making love in the morning, your body will be so impressed and enlivened by the changes in me that it will begin again all its old hormonal work of secreting womb cleaning and egg making." "I doubt it. Besides, I'm busy, you know. I have an awful lot to do." By this, I meant that our early morning, so full of reading last night's paper, dissenting and arguing appropriate actions, waking the boys, who should be really old enough to understand an alarm clock when it speaks to them without their mother's translation. Also, we had once had the moral or utilitarian idea that brainy labor must happen early. It must precede the work of love or be damaged by the residual weight of all that damp reality. But Jack said, "Come on." He unbuttoned his shirt. "My face is very fond of the gray-brown hairs of his chest." "Thanks," I said. "They won't work, you know. Miracles don't happen. If they do, they're absolutely explainable." He began to get a very rosy look about him, which is a nice thing to happen to a man's face. It's not called blushing. Blushing is an expression of shyness and female excitement. In men, it's observed as an energy blood takes on its determined own. "Think, think, think. Talk, talk, talk. That's you. Stop it. Come on, kid," he said. So, touching my knee, my thigh, breast, all the outsides of love, we lay down beside one another to make a child, with the modesty of later in life, which has so much history and erotic knowledge, but doesn't always use it. How else is one to extract a new person from all refusing Zeus and jealous Hera? "My God," said Jack, "you've never mentioned Greek gods in bed before." I had just started the coffee when Richard, my very large and handsome son, appeared. He's known far and wide for his nosy ear. "Why are you still in your pajamas?" I asked. He answered, "What is this crap, Mother? This life is short and terrible. What is this metaphysical shit? What is this disease you intelligentsia are always talking about?" First we said, "Intelligentsia? Us?" Oh, the way words lie down under decades. Then the union of restless diggers out of sheer insomnia pulls them up, daggers for the young. But to us they look like the flowers of nostalgia in our mother's garden. What did my mother say? "Darling, you should have come to town hall last night. The whole intelligentsia was there." So I laughed. But Jack said, "Don't you dare talk to your mother like that, Richard. Don't you dare." "Ma," Richard said, "get his brains out of the pickle jar. It's no insult. Everyone knows intelligentsia strikes a spark. They'll be relevant for a long time. It's okay, striking sparks here and there." Of course, he explained, the fire of revolution would only be advanced, contained, and put to productive use by the working class. Let me tell you, Jack, the intelligentsia better realize this. And another thing, where'd you get that don't dare talk to my mother stuff? I know her a lot longer than you do. I've been talking to her for maybe almost 18 years, and you've been sitting around our house maybe 3 years tops. Sorry, Richard. On a TV show last night, say that. Don't you dare talk to your mother like that. I'd gone over to see Anna about something. She turned on the TV the minute I came in. Wow, really? Listen, same thing happened to me too. I went to see Caitlin. You know her, around the corner, the doctor's daughter, the one whose kid brother tried to set fire to the nun a couple years ago. Well, you know, she did that too. The minute I came in, she turned on the TV. They were surprised that the girl and the woman, unknown to one another, had done exactly the same thing to each of them. Richard offered Jack a cigarette and sat down at the kitchen table. Coffee, Ma. Then Jack asked, Richard, tell me, do you forgive your father for having run out on you kids years ago? I don't forgive him, and I don't not forgive him. I can't spend my life on personal animosities. Ah. He blinked his eyes a couple of times, which a person who can't cry too well often does. Richard, did you know my father was a junk peddler? He had a push cart. He yelled in Yiddish, buy old clothes, buy old clothes. I had to go with him, walk up to the 5th floor, pick up stuff. I guess we crawled up and down every street in the Bronx. Buy old clothes, old clothes. Richard said, what do you think? Jack asked. Richard, do you think my daughter, I mean Kimmy, will she ever call me up and say, it's okay, Dad? Well, said Richard, nodding his head, shrugging his shoulders. I have to go to work now, I called. I don't happen to own my own business. Also, I have a late meeting tonight. You guys okay? The two men nodded, and they sat quietly together, expanding their lungs to the tiniest thread of tissue with smoke, breathing deeply, dangerously, in and out. Then, as often happens in stories, it was several years later. Jack had gone off to Arizona for a year to clear his lungs and sinuses, and also to have, hopefully, one last love affair, the kind that's full of terrific longing, ineluctable attraction, and so forth. I don't mean to mock it, but it's only natural to have some kind of reaction. Lots of luck, Jack, I said, but don't come home grouchy. The boys were in different boroughs trying to find the right tune for their lives. They had been men to a couple of women and therefore came for supper only now and then. They were worried for my solitariness, and they suggested different ways I could wear my hair. Of course, because of this planet which is dropping away from us in poisonous disgust, I'm hardly ever home. The other day, driving down the West Side Broadway after a long meeting, I was stopped at a red light. A man in the absolute prime of life crossed the street. For reasons of accumulating loneliness, I was stirred by his walk, his barest look at a couple of teenage girls. His nice, unimportant clothes seemed to be merely a shelter for the naked male person. I thought, oh man, in the very center of your life, still fitting your skin so nicely, with your arms probably in a soft cotton shirt and the shirt in an old tweed jacket, and your cock lying along your thigh in either your right or left pant slug, it's hard to tell which. Why have you slipped out of my sentimental and carnal grasp? He's nice, isn't he? I said to my friend Cassie. I suppose so, she said, but Faith, what is he, just a middle-class guy on his way home? To everyday life, I said, sighing with a mild homesickness. To whose everyday life, she said. God damn it, whose? She turned to me, which is hard to do when you're strapped and stuffed into a bucket seat. Listen, Faith, why don't you tell my story? You've told everybody's story about mine. And I don't even mean my whole story. That's my job. You probably can't. But I mean, you've just omitted me from the other stories. And I was there, in the restaurant, and the train, right there. Where's Cassie? Where is my life? It's been women and men, fucking, God damn it. Where the hell is my women and woman-loving life in all this? And it's not even sensible, because we are friends and we work together. And you even care about me at least as much as you do Ruthie and Louise and Ann. And you let them in all the time. It's really strange. Why have you left me out of everybody's life? I took a deep breath and turned the car to the curb. I couldn't drive. We sat there for about 20 minutes. Every now and then I'd say, my God, or Christ Almighty, neither of whom I usually call on, but she was stern and she wouldn't speak. Cassie, I finally said, I don't understand it either. It's true, though. I know what you mean. It must feel for you like a great absence of yourself. How could I allow it? But it's not me alone. It's them, too. I waited for her to say something. But it is my fault. But why? Why did you wait so long? And how can you forgive me? Forgive you? She laughed. But she reached across the clutch. With her hand, she turned my face to her so my eyes would look into her eyes. You are my friend. I know that, Faith. But I promise you, I won't forgive you, she said. From now on, I'll watch you like a hawk. I do not forgive you. I just want to read this one little piece from this other book. I think it's just a couple pages. Okay. It's called Traveling. My mother and sister were traveling south. The year was 1927. They had begun their journey in New York. They were going to visit my brother, who was studying in the South Medical College of Virginia. Their bus was an express and had stopped only in Philadelphia, Wilmington, and now Washington. Here, the darker people who had gotten on in Philadelphia or New York rose from their seats, put their bags and boxes together, and moved to the back of the bus. People who boarded in Washington knew where to seat themselves. My mother had heard that something like this would happen. My sister had heard of it too. They had not lived in it. This reorganization of passengers by color happened in silence. My mother and sister remained in their seats, which were about 3/4 of the way back. When everyone was settled, the bus driver began to collect tickets. My sister saw him coming. She pinched my mother. Ma, look! Of course my mother saw him too. What frightened my sister was the quietness, the white people in front, the black people in back, silent. The driver sighed, said, "You can't sit here, ma'am. It's for them," waving over his shoulder to the Negroes, among whom they were now sitting. "Move, please." My mother said, "No." He said, "You don't understand, ma'am. It's against the law. You have to move to the front." My mother said, "No." When I first tried to write this scene, I imagined my mother saying, "That's all right, mister. We're comfortable. I can't change my seat every minute." I read this invention to my sister. She said, "It was nothing like that." My mother did not try to be friendly or pretend innocence. While my sister trembled in the silence, my mother said, for the third time, quietly, "No." Somehow, finally, they were in Richmond, and there was my brother in school, among so many American boys. After hugs and my mother's anxious looks at her young son, my sister said, "Vic, you know what Mama did?" My brother remembers thinking, "What? Oh, she wouldn't move?" He had a classmate, a Jewish boy like himself, but from Virginia, who had had a public confrontation with a Negro man. He had punched that man hard, knocked him down. My brother couldn't believe it. He was stunned. He couldn't imagine a Jewish boy wanting to knock anyone down. He had never wanted to, but he thought, looking back, that he'd been set down to work and study in a nearly foreign place and had to get used to it. Then he told me about the Second World War, when the disgrace of black soldiers being forced to sit behind white German POWs shook him, shamed him. About 15 years later, in 1943, in early summer, I rode that bus for about 3 days from New York to Miami Beach, where my husband, in sweaty fatigues, along with hundreds of other boys, was trudging up and down the streets and beaches to prepare themselves for war. By late afternoon of the second long day, we were well into the South, beyond Richmond, maybe South Carolina, Georgia. My excitement about travel in the wide world was damaged a little by a sudden fear I might not recognize Jess or he me. We hadn't seen each other for 2 months. I took a photograph out of my pocket. Yes, I would know him. I had been sleeping, waking, reading, writing, dozing, waking, So many hours. The movement of the passengers was something like a tide that sometimes ebbed and now seemed to be noisily rising. I opened my eyes to the sound of new people brushing past my aisle seat and looked up to see a colored woman holding a large sleeping baby who, with the heaviness of sleep, his arms so tight around her neck, seemed to be pulling her head down. I looked around and noticed that I was in the last white row. The press of travelers had made it impossible for her to move farther back. She seemed so tired. I had been sitting and sitting for a day and a half at least. Not thinking, maybe refusing to think, I offered her my seat. She looked to the right and left as well as she could. Softly she said, "Oh no." I became fully awake. A white man was standing right beside her, but on the other side of the invisible, absolute racial border. Of course she couldn't accept my seat. Her sleeping child hung mercilessly from her neck. She shifted a little to balance the burden. She whispered to herself, "Oh, I just don't know, I don't know." So I said, "Well, at least give me the baby." First she turned, barely looking at the man beside her. He made no move. So, to my surprise, she disengaged the child from her body and placed him on my lap. He was deep in child sleep. He stirred, but not enough to bother himself or me. I liked holding him, aligning him along my 22-year-old young woman's shape. I thought ahead to that holding, that breathing together that would happen in my life if this war would ever end. I was so comfortable under his nice weight, I closed my eyes for a couple of minutes, but suddenly opened them to look up into the face of a white man talking. In a loud voice, he addressed me. "Lady, I wouldn't have touched that thing with a meat hook." I thought, oh, this world will end in ice. I could do nothing but look straight into his eyes. I did not look away from him. Then I held that boy a little tighter, kissed his curly head, pressed him even closer, so that he began to squirm. So sleepy, he reshaped himself inside my arms. His mother tried to narrow herself away from that dangerous border, too frightened at first to move at all. After a couple of minutes, she leaned forward a little, placed her hand on the baby's head and held it there until the next stop. I couldn't look up. I write this remembrance more than 50 years later. Back at that mother and child. Her hand on his head is quite still, though she tries by spreading her fingers wide to hide him from the white man. But the child I'm holding, his little face as he turns toward me, is the brown face of my own grandson, my daughter's boy, the open mouth, the full lips, the thick little body of a child who runs wildly from one end of the yard to the other, leaps from dangerous heights with certain experienced caution, muscling his body, his mind, for coming realities. Of course, when my mother and sister returned from Richmond, the family at home wanted to know, how was Vic doing in school? Among all those Gentiles. Was the long bus, the anti-Semitism really bad or just normal? What happened on the bus? What happened on the bus? I was probably present at that supper, the attentive listener and total forgetter of information that had immediately started to form me. Then, last year, my sister, casting the net of old age, through which recent experience easily slips, brought up that old story. First, I was angry. How come you never told me about your bus ride with Mama? I mean, really so many years ago, 70. I don't know, she said. Anyway, you were only about 4 years old then, and besides, maybe I did tell you. I asked my brother why we'd never talked about that day. He said he thought now it had had a great effect on him. He had tried unraveling its meaning for years. Then life, family, work happened. So I imagined him, a youngster really, a kid from the Bronx in Virginia in 1927. Why, he was a stranger there himself. In the next couple of weeks, we continued to talk about our mother, the way she was principled, adamant, and at the same time, so shy. What else could we remember? Well, I said, I have a story about those buses too. Then I told it to them, how it happened, on just such a journey when I was still quite young that I first knew my grandson, first held him close, but could protect him for only about 20 minutes 50 years ago. I think now we're, if people want to ask me some questions, in case I didn't answer them in the stories. No, anyway, about anything, I'd be glad to answer them. And I should have asked you this earlier. Could you hear me? I mean, if you'll have to put your hand up because I can't see into the light.
I just read recently the last story that you read.
Yeah.
Where was that?
It was in the New Yorker.
That's what it.
Yeah.
It must have been him.
Now it's in the book. Yeah. Yeah, I can't see.
Do you write from personal experience?
Huh?
Personal.
What?
Are your stories from personal experience?
Well, this one, the last thing I read was I tried to be as accurate as I could. As you see, I kept checking up with my sister what my mother really said. And in a way, I was writing the story to find out for myself what really happened in these two journeys, these three journeys, really. And so I tried to be very accurate. In other stories, a lot of it is sort of made up. I mean, in the immigrant story, the conversation, the dialogue between the man and woman are really, could be any argument I ever had with some guy. And, and it goes on from there. But the rest part of it is a story someone told me. Sometimes there's stories people tell me. And you have to do two things. I mean, the way I put it usually is you begin with what you know, but you really write towards what you don't know, because that's what's interesting. If you really knew everything you were going to write, you may as well not bother to write it. It's my theory, anyway. I mean, you write in order to both think and feel and understand. And if you already understand everything, you could go do something else for a living. You have to have a certain amount of ignorance. Yeah. Yes?
How do you remember your childhood? As happy or in any other way? How do you remember your own childhood?
You mean, what do you mean, how do I remember it? Did I like it?
We grew up in the same family, but my sister had a very unhappy childhood.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I don't know how, so.
Well, I had a pretty nice one. I lived among people who seemed to like me. I lived on a street that was very interesting. Yeah?
One thing that I noticed in your fiction is sometimes when you're writing, it's almost like the narrator takes a step back then and looks at the writing.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about that technique a little bit, or the way that you do that, if you could just address that.
I don't really know how to talk about it. I mean, it's a hard thing to talk about. It's just something that, you try things. You try all kinds of things in order to think about what you're doing and to be truthful and so on. And also to say where you're coming from. I mean, I've never liked to pretend I was coming from somewhere else. So I think I've tried doing things like that, and you haven't read the times it didn't work. But these times that you've read, it seems to have worked a little bit. There are a lot of characters. When you write a story, there are a lot of characters. There's the person who, the people that you're writing about, and they're there. And then there's the person who's telling the story, and that's really that's the person you hear. It isn't really me who's stepping back. It's really the person who's telling the story. It's the narrator who steps back, and I give permission. Yeah. Yes.
Looking back over all the things that you've written, do you have a personal favorite that keeps coming back to you as something you like the best?
No, I mean, at different times I read different stories, you know. Yeah. I go through periods where I'll read the same thing for a few times, and then, sometimes there are some stories I've never read, and I don't know why, and I think some of them I think are odd, and I should really be more courageous and read them. Yeah. I can't see anybody over there except you.
Who do you like to read?
Well, we were talking about that, and I guess one of the people I was reading a lot at a certain point was a story writer named Gina Burial, whom I liked very much.
Who was that?
Gina Burial, and she's from the West Coast, and she's a real storyteller as far as that's concerned. And there are so many other people that I read that I can't even begin to tell you who they are. I mean, there are writers that you may not know so well, like E.M. Broner, who's a wonderful writer, Esther Broner, and only she writes under the name E.M. Broner. And she has many wonderful stories, and she has a marvelous novel right now that she's just finished, things like that. I liked Mary Gordon's book, Spending, a lot. I thought it was a lot of fun, and that people couldn't take it, that she had such a good time talking about sex.
Who?
Mary Gordon's book, Spending. That's, I mean, a recent novel. There are a lot of people writing right now that are... There are wonderful writers writing right now who are come from all kinds of... Leslie Marmon Silko is a Native American writer who's a really great writer, for instance, and hasn't begun to be read enough. That's one person. Well, you and then you, yeah.
How did you like the way the film Enormous changes at the last minute? How did you like seeing your stories turned into film?
How did I like it? Well, who's talking? Oh, because I had pointed at that guy. So, yeah. And then, yeah. That's okay. I'll answer it anyway. I liked how did I like the film? Oh, well,
seeing your stories turned into film.
Well, it was a long time ago, you know. And there were many nice things about that film. The first one especially was very good. The one with Ellen Barkin in it was beautiful, I thought. And the second one was very good. I liked as well. The third one went in a totally different direction than I felt that my story had been. So like any writer, I got so, I said, well, that's not what I said. Well, all that kind of thing, But the people were good. It was very interesting to me. I mean, I kind of, it didn't have to be exactly the way I wrote it for me to like it. And in a way, I thought, especially the second one, this is not how I saw this or that, but isn't that an interesting idea? So, yes, now.
You've been a political activist your whole life.
Yeah.
And also a writer and an artist. There are some people who think there is a irreconcilable conflict between those two things. You obviously don't. How do you respond to young writers who say you can't be both?
Well, it's a very peculiar kind of a sentence. I mean, people say that all the time, but they only say it in this country. I mean, the idea that in other countries in South America, or Europe, or any part of Europe or Africa, or any place, that writers would be expected to be unpolitical would makes them laugh, I think. I mean, I haven't seen them really laughing personally. But I'm sure they can hardly believe it, you know, they can hardly believe that idea. So I don't even have to, I think maybe it's who you are and what you want to say and whether you want to say it. But the idea that you have to be some kind of a neutral observer is so foolish that because nobody can be. So you have to write from you have to be writing from some political position. And so no matter what your politics are, most books are very political, only they don't seem to be because that's the American condition. Fear of politics. Yeah.
What is your approach to rewriting?
Pardon me?
How do you approach rewriting, if that may be necessary?
A woman asked, what is my approach to rewriting?
And also, if I may add, if you ever lack inspiration.
Am I ever what?
If you ever lack for inspiration, or if you find yourself in a bit of a down mode, how do you get your writing back in?
Well, I'll give you the second answer is when you're lacking in inspiration, you're in despair, so that takes care of that. You know, I mean, you feel rotten. But usually, if you're writing a lot, you usually have, at least in your pocket, you have lots of pieces of paper that you've been writing notes on. You know, I was telling the students earlier today, or notebooks in which you've been thinking about things. So, you know, there's always, it's only a question of really getting into things. There's always something to do. You know, and if there's not, there's usually a reason. And some of the reasons that you sometimes are blocked in that way is you don't want to tell the truth, you know, you really don't want to write. Or you don't really want to write what you have to write, that's what I mean. I mean, you want to write anything, but anything is not interesting to you. And the thing you really need to write, and the truth you really have to tell, you don't want to tell. And you'll do anything not to do it, including, you know, put up a wall between yourself and your paper. I mean, that's just an idea I had. The other thing is about revising and changing, you know, some people are very fluent and can really write off pretty well. But as for myself, I'm very, my first drafts are very bad. And so I have to revise a lot, or I don't like the word revise. I think if you think of it in a different way, if you think of it as trying to get the work closer and closer to what you really mean to say. You know, you read this thing, and you look at it, and it's as though someone else wrote it, that first draft. You know, you haven't said a thing you mean to say, and the people aren't even talking sensibly or anything. So you have to want to do it, though, as far as that's concerned. You have to really have a great longing. A longing to get it as close to what you want to say. You have to have that longing, and without it, you don't do it, you know. You can do something else. Yeah?
Do you watch television? And if so, what? And do you have any advice for writers in this particular day and age?
Well, I watch television every time I'm in a hotel room. You know, we don't have a television though, but you know, my family does. So I do see things a lot. I have some sense of what's happening in the world. But are you talking when you ask me what I want to tell writers in relation to television? Huh?
Bombarded with a lot of chatter that doesn't really do a lot for writers, I don't think. And I wondered if that's maybe the reason you don't have a television or you don't watch it.
No, I don't have a television because my husband is stubborn. I would have one. But then I would look at it a lot, and it probably wouldn't be such a good idea. But I don't, I'm not afraid. I personally am not afraid of the culture. I think one is afraid for one's children. That's another story entirely. And that's why we worry about whether they're reading a lot or not. I don't think about that too much, so I really can't give you a straight answer. Yeah.
You just published a book.
Yeah.
Now, is there another book in formation? What is your future?
Good God, I just did this. I mean, it takes me 10 years, you know. What you should be asking me is, will you live to do another book? I'm working mostly on poems right now, and probably that's what I'll do next. I can't see if, I feel I've really been very bad to the people under that light there, so if anybody over there wants to ask me something, I've been ignoring you. And if not, I want to thank you all for coming.
Thank you. We'd like to invite all of you now downstairs to the Great Hall of the Museum, where we'll have a reception. We have books for sale, and Miss Paley will be doing a book signing. Thank you all for coming.